is going to present the main findings of the report and as well as talk a little bit about what we are already doing in the next phase of our technical assistance support to the government. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Jari, and hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Laybourne, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. It's been a long journey to get to the end of this roadmap, but I'm very glad to be able to present this today and just talk a little bit about some of the main findings. It is an extensive report. It's well over 200 pages. There's a lot of technical information in there, a lot more than we can get through in this little session, but I hope to give you a bit of a flavour of what's contained within it. So we set out on this report over a year ago now and commissioned the global consultancy company COWI to lead a team of local and international consultants on the technical analysis for this work. And the intention really is to look at Sri Lanka's opportunity for offshore wind. So looking at the potential, some of the challenges that might be faced in developing offshore wind, and start to provide some evidence to help policymakers have a more informed view as to what offshore wind could do and the role it could play. And we hope that this roadmap also provides information generally and knowledge and helps to educate local stakeholders as well as international developers in the wider industry that are looking at new opportunities to deliver offshore wind. We've also used this work to look at some of the potential first projects that Sri Lanka could focus on. So how does it start its offshore wind industry and where should it focus its efforts on? I think a very important question that any government has to answer when they're starting out a new industry is why? Why are we doing this? Why are we thinking about offshore wind for Sri Lanka? And a lot of these points have already been made by previous speakers, but perhaps just to emphasize some of those. Decarbonisation is the top of everyone's agenda, contributing to Sri Lanka's renewable energy targets and further beyond that. Security supply is equally important up there with decarbonisation, but in Sri Lanka's context, particularly reducing its foreign payments for fossil fuel imports. Offshore wind can also bring economic benefits, bringing in inward investments, setting up new industries and manufacturing potentially, as well as creating new jobs. Importantly for an island, it's about reducing land use that is valuable for other sectors, particularly agriculture. And we've also mentioned energy exports, whether that be through an interconnector to India or the production of green hydrogen or other green fuels. There's a lot of different opportunities here for Sri Lanka, and this is a technology that's worth considering. And the map on the right here shows some of the offshore wind resource that the country has. And you can see with the red areas, there's some quite extensive resource. But it's not all usable. So as part of the work, we've looked at some of the main issues that can be faced with developing offshore wind, particularly things that are environmentally, socially, or technically difficult or sensitive or risky. And the three maps that we've got here look at some of those data sets that have come together to understand where these environmental sensitivities are, the social sensitivities, and some of the technical constraints are. You'll notice, that, unfortunately, that a lot of the areas that are very good for offshore wind resource have got a number of environmental and social and technical issues. However, we've combined those together, and when you look at those as a whole, we still do have large areas that are lower risk, or areas in some cases that have very few environmental, social, or technical constraints. So if we take from the wind resource on the furthest left here, adding those constraints on, we end up with these areas of offshore wind potential. And we've considered some areas as exclusion zones, and particularly these are legally protected areas, for instance, marine reserves as an example, that are protected for protected species like dugong or seagrass or blue whales. So really sensitive habitats and biodiversity that we want to try and avoid with developing offshore wind. So we've taken those out and said that those are exclusion zones. They may change in the future if there's more evidence and knowledge to look at those areas in more detail. There are some restriction zones, which are areas that are still high risk, but again, more needs to be understood. Because at the moment, this analysis is just considering the existing desktop information that is available to us, and there is so much that is still unknown about the seas and the biodiversity and the habitats within it. That said, we can't develop all of these areas, but assuming if the areas that we've got so far for offshore wind potential, if we look at all of those and assume that offshore wind was built out across those different areas, the country's got over 56 gigawatts of potential. About half of that is fixed, so fixed foundations in shallower waters, and about half of that is for floating offshore wind for deeper water conditions. Now, again, not all of that area is going to be usable. There are going to be additional constraints that are going to be found as more studies occur and stakeholders are engaged. And these do not also consider economic factors. So some of these areas will also be just purely too expensive to build out. So you focus on the areas that appear to be lowest risk and appear to have the lowest costs. As part of the roadmap, we've looked at 2 different growth scenarios, and these are hypothetical scenarios to start to think about how an industry or a market in Sri Lanka could evolve. One being a low growth, so sort of a fairly more modest growth scenario, and one being a much more optimistic higher growth scenario. And these are just hypothetical. They're not set as targets. They're not set as exactly what will happen. It's just looking at what could happen. So under a low growth scenario, delivering maybe a modest amount of capacity by the end of this decade and a little bit more by the end of the next decade, and again doubling that in 2050. Comparatively with the high growth scenario, taking a far more optimistic approach with about 1 gigawatt of offshore wind by the end of this decade, doubling that by 2040 and doubling again by 2050. From conversations with the ministry, it feels that the government is moving more towards the high growth scenario, and that is a really good opportunity, and I think optimistic vision to set. But where can this industry start? And this has been again a part of the focus of the work, is taking all of that information, the data, and the discussions we've had with stakeholders, and identifying a few areas that feel like the most promising. And again, caveating this by saying that there is still a lot we don't know, and that needs to be investigated further. And I'll mention that in some further work we're doing in a second. So the 2 main areas we feel are up in the Mannar region, very close to Adams Bridge and close to some of the onshore wind farms that have been built on Mannar Island, and the region of Putalam, off the west coast there. So Mannar's got very good wind speeds, it's close to the grid, but there are a number of environmental sensitivities there, particularly with the marine reserve off to the east of that area. Putalam is close to shore, it's got very good proximity to grid and the port of Colombo, fewer environmental risks from what we could find. However, the wind speeds are a little lower in Putalam. The southeast has got some very good offshore wind speeds, but there are many environmental and social sensitivities, particularly with sensitive habitats, blue whale population, a lot of fishing. There's a lot of marine traffic through there as well, so it's quite a difficult area to use for offshore wind. It also gets very deep very quickly, so there's difficult seabed conditions and metocean conditions, and the transmission in that region needs some strengthening. So we felt that is an area that may be considered for future development, but perhaps not the best area to start with. And our recommendation for how this could be started and the approach that could be taken, we still feel that there is a lot that is not known about these 2 sites, and our advice here has been to start looking at these areas in more detail, looking at some of these wind conditions, environmental and social issues, considering that the regulatory environment and the framework that we needed to deliver offshore wind, and bringing this all together over the next year or 2, leading up towards a competition to allocate competitively these areas for the first projects. And as Yari mentioned earlier, we've already been working on some of these topics. And just to give you a flavor of some of the things that we've been doing, the map off to the right here shows some updated wind analysis that we've taken from global wind models that have then been calibrated against onshore coastal physical met mast measurements. So these are long-term data records to help calibrate that model and get a more accurate sense of what the wind speed and wind conditions are like. However, it's still very important to get actual data from offshore sites, and that scoping work is underway as we speak to look at what that campaign could look like to better understand the data or the wind conditions offshore. We've recently run a procurement to get some legal and regulatory support to look at the frameworks that are in place in Sri Lanka already and identify the gaps that are there that would prevent offshore wind being developed and how those could be filled. And that contract is being issued shortly. And we also have an expression of interest that's open at the moment, and the deadline is next week. And that is for a larger package of technical and commercial pre-feasibility level analysis to look at these two areas in more detail, considering the types of projects, the design of projects that could be put in these areas, but starting to delve into those environmental and social issues in more depth, and also bringing in stakeholder engagement to understand these areas again in more detail. And we're also starting some work on further grid assessment very soon to look at potential connection points for hypothetical projects in both of these areas. So the roadmap, I suppose, in conclusion, sets out a number of actions and recommendations for how the government could act to take offshore wind forward, prioritizing those into short-term or near-term actions, setting the target for offshore wind and putting offshore wind into the generation and transmission plans. Then over the next few years, starting to prepare the background of the underlying data for these Pathfinder projects, these first projects, then handing those projects over to the private sector to develop through a transparent, competitive process. And then it's about the private sector coming in and delivering these projects and capacity and working with the government to bring in finance and funding to make these projects a reality. So just to summarize here then in key messages, we feel that Sri Lanka has got some excellent offshore wind potential, good conditions that could bring in many benefits for the country. There are still many environmental and social issues. We've got a reasonable understanding of them, but again, we need to understand these in more detail. There's a lot of difficulties in connecting projects to the grid, just due to their pure size. And again, that will require careful planning and consideration. Offshore wind, we know, can bring economic development and benefits. We've seen this in many other markets, and I think collaborating with India and considering the opportunity that is happening in Tamil Nadu as we speak, there is definite benefit there for collaboration across those two markets and mutual benefit for economic development. And final point is that we've identified some of these areas for the first projects that we feel are the priority to look at, and are underway with further assessment to look at those areas in more detail. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to hand back to Yari and we'll go into some questions and answers.
Thank you, Mark. Before we get to the Q&A session, I would like to hand the floor to the Honorable Minister Kanchana Wijesekara, who has been a strong supporter of our work. We thank you for that and the support of all your team as well. So over to you, Minister, for your thoughts on the opportunity that offshore wind provides for the country.
Thank you, Ari. Good afternoon, everyone. His Excellency Andrew Patrick, High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, Deputy High Commissioner, Secretary to the Ministry of Power and Energy, heads of different government institutes, members of the World Bank, IFC, and other stakeholders taking that are part online and in person. First of all, let me thank Yari, Mark, and the team from World Bank for making this possible today, for presenting the offshore potential that Sri Lanka do have. We've been working a long time on this project. I would like to thank the World Bank, IFC, the British High Commission, ESMAP, PROBLUE, and the teams that have been involved in this task from the Ministry of Power and Energy, Sustainable Energy Authority, and other relevant stakeholders. As you correctly said, Sri Lanka do the immense potential for renewable energy in terms of offshore wind. That potential far exceeds our requirements as a nation. Sri Lanka has made its plans for 70% renewable energy by 2030. And we did also give a commitment for carbon neutrality by 2050. But recently, the President, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has advanced that commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040. So all the commitments that we have given to the international organizations, the COP26, monopole power plants, all those commitments will be honored by the Sri Lankan government. And as the Ministry of Power and Energy, the stakeholders, we have made plans to see how we can integrate these renewable energy opportunities that we have. One important step would be the grid planning in this development. The other would be planning so that we do accomplish these things and start developing with the same timeline that the Indian government launches its offshore wind roadmap as well. That way we share the costs, that way we reduce the logistics cost involved in it, and also make sure that more developers internationally recognized, technically capable, financially that are capable of investing in these sort of projects are attracted to not just India but Sri Lanka, and use the resources not just for our own requirements, but Sri Lanka's aim is to be energy independent and to export excess energy, to share energy with regional countries. And we're looking forward to that with the interconnectivity with India and also other BIMSTEC countries so that we share the resources that we have. Recently, we've had to accelerate our programs due to the climate change effects that's affecting Sri Lanka as well. As you're well aware, Sri Lanka is right now going through one of the worst droughts in history, and our hydro capacities have depreciated. The first time in our history, we've had to release water from even our power generation hydropower plants for agricultural and drinking water needs. So in the future, we do need to take this into consideration. Of course, in the next couple of years, we will have to plan out in a way how we're going to decommission some of the thermal power plants, but also making sure that the energy security of Sri Lanka is also sustained. So offshore wind, even though it's a costly development tool, it's something that's vital for the future. And we have developed large projects in Sri Lanka for onshore wind. And we are hoping by end of next year to have the largest onshore wind facility in Sri Lanka, 500 megawatts, with the development assistance and the investment of the Adani Group, and as well as on competitive bidding with the CEB for 150 megawatts of wind power. It's the second stage of the Manara Wind Power project that has been done by CEB. So we have made the groundwork, the legal framework for that, and with the new Electricity Act to be tabled in Parliament very shortly, we open that open market access, competitiveness, and more new technology involved in these programs would help us achieve these targets. Not going to take too long. I once again thank everyone who has supported us, assisted us during the worst financial crisis and the energy crisis in the last 14 months, and also making sure that we are ready to be competitive, ready to develop offshore wind and other renewable energy requirements so that we achieve our renewable targets and the commitments that we have given to other organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Kanchana, for your remarks. So we are moving on to the question and answer session. For anyone online, please click the three buttons next to your chat bubble on the right bottom corner and type your questions in there. And we'll try to pick a few of them at least now and may respond to others later. So maybe to kick off, we have also in the meeting room with the minister, we have the chairman of CB, we have the chairman of Sustainable Energy Authority, and of course the Secretary Power. So we have, as well as general manager of CB, I can see there. So we have some questions that may be directed to you as well. Maybe the chairman of the Sustainable Energy Authority could answer the question of how does this offshore wind development plan fit into the larger plan of renewable energy development in the country, for example, solar? Over to you, Mr. Stepan.
Actually, according to your plan, we already decided, I think, the discussion with the finding by 2030, 500 to 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind will be connected with the accelerated project. And the in addition to that, there are plans for the solar power by 2030. With the CB already accepted, so develop or the connected to the grid around 4,700 of solar power, and the other 1,100 megawatts of wind offshore, onshore wind to the grid. So CB already provided the required grid capacity.
Gary, if I could add something, I think we have to work hand in hand with the Offshore Wind Roadmap as well as the Green Hydrogen Roadmap as well. So the Sri Lanka Petroleum Development Authority with the other relevant stakeholders have already done the feasibility studies on how we could achieve the Green Hydrogen Roadmap and implement that. So we hope to publish that as well in the next 2 weeks. So green hydrogen is one area that we're looking at, maybe use the offshore wind potential. Even if the grid connectivity infrastructure development takes some time, maybe we could start with green hydrogen as an option to transform the renewable energy potential that we do have.
Indeed, and if I may just comment, if the full potential of offshore wind is developed, and as hydrogen technologies develop and their costs come down, that could indeed be an opportunity for very deep decarbonization in the future that the country is striving for by 2050. And of course, in the short term, the other renewable resources that the country has in wind and solar can and need to be explored, because offshore wind project development is a longer term prospect. Developing an offshore wind project takes quite a few years. So in the meanwhile, the country is of course pushing forward with its other renewable energy resources and projects. There's a question about the economic impact of offshore wind and skill sets that are required for it, and whether developing offshore wind projects in Sri Lanka could mean that all the workforce is brought from other countries. Maybe this is something that I don't know, Mark, or we have also from COWI, our consultants, Eric Moore and Martin from the Global Wind Energy Council, who is working globally on wind and offshore wind. So I don't know if who would like to take a stab at that one.
I'm happy to start. Thank you very much. Honored to participate. I can say that, in my opinion, this is a transition process that takes some time, and therefore it is not something that would take over labor from elsewhere, but gradually integrate these works in offshore wind step by step. So I don't see that labor elsewhere would be missing. I think it would be a great addition, which is growing over time, therefore building the labor force gradually. Maybe Mark wants to add something to that.
I fully agree, Eric, and I think the point about developing offshore wind is not just about the power; it is about the economic benefits as well. But it has to be a balanced approach with bringing in expertise from elsewhere and supplementing that with local knowledge and expertise. And they have to have the local component in the construction, but also during the operations and maintenance, because that's where the long-term jobs will be over the 30-year lifetime of these projects. So there has to be a big mixture of international firms, expertise, capabilities, because it's such a wide supply chain that's required to build and operate these projects. Martin, perhaps we could hear from you from Global Wind Energy Council and your view from India as well.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for having GWEG in this room. Firstly, I want to convey my heartiest congratulations to Honorable Minister. We had the honor and privilege of meeting His Excellency and his team earlier in March, and we are very happy that we'll be hosting a high-level delegation from Sri Lanka at our forthcoming APEC Summit, which commences from the 28th of August in Melbourne. Coming to the question, I think from the perspective of economic benefit and jobs creation, number one is that as compared to any other mature renewable energy technology, particularly utility scale solar and wind, offshore has much more job creation potential. A 500 megawatt power plant can create almost more than 8,000 full-time jobs over its lifetime. So number one, that. Now, number two is that it is often perceived that jobs in offshore wind, because a country A or B doesn't have the capacity at the moment. So I think I totally agree with Eric and Mark that it is only something which is in transition process. And once we have maturity, once we have reached scale, there is significant amount of jobs that will be created locally. But even during the initial stages, in terms of jobs that will be created for coastal communities that might engage into providing O&M services in the later stages, but in the initial stages, they can support the offshore developers in ferrying their resource persons to the marshalling port or to the site where the offshore wind project has to be developed. There'll be assembling units that will have to be set at the port location, from where the offshore installation vessel will take the resources, components, the subcomponents will have to be exported to the actual site. So there is huge potential for jobs creation across the value chain. And these jobs will not just be created in the area of power development, but also in the area of the entire the export of power from the offshore to onshore. So I think let's see it from the entire value chain perspective. And on that note, Sri Lanka is well poised. They already have a very huge skill base. They already have expertise in utility scale grid system. And all of that is going to support Government of Sri Lanka's strides for offshore wind. So on that note, there is substantial potential for jobs creation through power development, through development of industries that will support offshore wind, through services that will have to be provided to support the offshore wind industry. And then from the economic point of view, as Sri Lanka has already set a target, a very ambitious target of going 100% carbon neutral in the coming future, and they already have more than 48% of power that comes from renewable energy. So offshore is certainly going to cut on the import bill, and I think Mark has already and Jari have already put the report, of course, touches upon how important offshore wind is going to play a role in cutting the import bill. So on that note, there are various perspectives on economic growth opportunities that arise from offshore wind, but one, of course, is the trade of power. We are already seeing that now countries are collaborating for establishing cross-country grid. There's power trade happening between India and Nepal, India and Bangladesh, and now as part of the Green Grids initiative, a grid between the Middle East and India is being planned to exploit the difference in time, the difference in availability of solar intensity during 24-hour bandwidth. So I think there is substantial opportunity for power trade between India and Sri Lanka, and I think it was already discussed during earlier part of the presentation. So there's immense opportunity, but we must undertake a value chain approach wherein there is a win-win partnership available for all stakeholders, and that's how we will reach from initial stages to transition stage, and then gradually to maturity, and eventually we will be able to scale up. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Let's see, there's a bunch of questions. I'm not sure we have time for everyone, but there's one for the minister directly, if you allow me, sir. There's a question about how do you see these types of projects being developed going forward in the future in the new sector structure that the government is envisaging?
We're looking at with the new Electricity Act, we are looking at structuring it in a way that competitive bidding is given a priority in all these projects that will take place in the future. So we are at the moment planning out what sort of energy would be integrated from which areas. So we have already published the 2030 transmission grid plan as well from CEP, how the grid connections, transmission lines take place. And we have already started work from the Sustainable Energy Authority, also the Ceylon Electricity Board. One, identifying the resource. Number two, identifying the land area, develop the resource, so that we do go for a land acquisition, get the resource secured, and then go for a competitive bidding procedure, so that we allow technically and financially capable developers to come to the table. So in doing that, I think the new Electricity Act will also go a long way, because there are certain legal provisions that will be made in that to facilitate these new initiatives. And also, offshore wind is going to take some time to develop. We'll also identify onshore wind resources. So the onshore wind potential that have been estimated by the SCA is about 10 gigawatts of onshore wind, which 5 gigawatts could be developed with the land and the availability. And also, we have identified the large portion of it would be renewable energy integration would be from solar. We've identified about 360 gigawatts of renewable energy potential on solar, which could be developed up to about 200 gigawatts of solar power into the grid. So right now, the 2023-27 plan, the 27-30 plans have already been published. So according to that, we are streamlining, expediting the work on the 27 plan. So the rest would be planned, made available to suitable developers.
Thank you, Minister. Maybe I'll direct one for the IFC country manager, Alejandro. There's a question. Sri Lanka's banking sector is collaborating to raise sustainable finance. Is IFC in a position to support the sustainable banking initiative and to prepare for these offshore wind investments? And maybe you can comment more generally about what could be financing sources for these types of investments. There are also questions related to financing the interconnection and other grid investments. So maybe if someone from the room or some of the panelists would like to jump in on that one. Over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you, Jari. So to respond to that question, the answer is yes, absolutely. IFC is committed to working with the financial sector here on sustainable finance and green finance. In fact, we are already doing that. I'll mention a couple of things that we've been doing. So Sri Lanka is part of the Sustainable Banking Network, which is managed by IFC and includes both regulators and commercial banks. We have supported the CBSL, the central bank, on a green taxonomy for the financial sector, which hopefully will start being used and implemented. And very recently, we organized a conference also on green financing, where we invited financial sector players, but also other companies and stakeholders. And the idea is to start working with the financial sector on sustainable finance initiatives, of which offshore wind could be one. But obviously, it's not only limited to offshore wind or renewable energy, but also to areas like energy efficiency. We have programs like green buildings that we can finance, decarbonization efforts in the manufacturing sectors and others, e-mobility activities. And so there are many areas, green bonds and other capital market instruments that we would be willing to support as well, that go into sustainable financing. So not only offshore wind, but many other activities. Thanks.
Maybe I'll answer one question. There's a question whether the offshore wind development is basically conditioned to the interconnector with India, whether it's a precondition for developing offshore wind. Our analysis and our view is that you can certainly do maybe 1-2 projects for the Sri Lankan need. And of course, the demand for electricity in Sri Lanka is going to also grow tremendously over the next 10, 20, 30 years and beyond. So there's a lot more demand for electricity. And of course, the green hydrogen option might be there as well. But if an interconnector with India is realized, which has many other benefits in terms of diversifying supply, hopefully lowering cost of supply for both countries, and bringing stability to the system and ability to integrate renewables. Actually, some of our analysis shows that if you have the interconnection, you would not need to invest as much in, for example, storage in Sri Lanka itself. But if there is an interconnector, then of course the large potentials of offshore wind in Sri Lanka and in the region more broadly can be brought into the market. And there's a very large market, obviously, in India, to which this Sri Lankan energy could be exported. So over to the next question. Sorry, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, Yari, if I could suggest one thing, since we're running out of time as well, if you could share the questions with us, we can ask the relevant institute heads and the stakeholders to answer to each individual question as well. And one pre-requirement that we would have in the future for development of any renewable energy development project would not just be finance, because a lot of people do come with the financing, but without the technology. So it has to be technology as well with the financing. So that's one of the pre-requirements that we will have in the future.
Definitely. Yes, we'll share these questions with the ministry. And there was a question how we can get the PowerPoint. We'll share the PowerPoint with the participants to this event, as well as the report is available for download on the World Bank ESMAP website. I'll try to copy it to the chat in a second. Very quickly, maybe one more question, and then Mr. Sepala, Chairman of the Sustainable Energy Authority, will say just a couple of closing remarks. There's a question, what size the first project should be, and how does that look? How should we or Sri Lanka start the first project? What size, what kind of capacity might be the place to start with? Maybe Mark, you want to comment on that one?
We can get some views. So you need to have enough scale to be able to attract developers who have experienced offshore wind developers, but also to help reduce the costs, fixed costs in building and developing an offshore wind farm. And if those can be spread out over more megawatts, then the cost of energy comes down. And typically, the industry and offshore wind developers are looking for projects that are at least 500 megawatts. So somewhere between, let's say, 500 megawatts and 1,000 megawatts, depending on the site, depending on the grid connection availabilities, is probably a reasonable size, particularly when considering the size magnitude of projects that are being proposed off Tamil Nadu, just across the water.
Thank you, Mark. With that, I think we are indeed running out of time, and I'll hand over to Chairman Sepala to close off this session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Jari. Thank you, Smith. With this primary understanding, the facts elaborated by every side, we can keep our entire focus on renewable energy to fill the gaps of low-cost and sustainable energy needs. Further, it will facilitate more strong investment flow, not only the energy requirement, but also strengthen the economic in Sri Lanka. Accelerating of harnessing of offshore wind energy, we may be in a position to absorb energy of offshore wind by 2030. As you all mentioned, the capacity will be 500 to 1,000 megawatts. Then our power system base load will replace with the renewable energy instead of running fossil fuel run generation. So at the end, I would like to thank our Minister and who are facing all the challenges in this critical junction from inside and outside to maintain a stable and low-cost energy to the people of Sri Lanka. So our great gratitude for you all the time. And I would like to thank Excellency and Patrick, who came all the way for just 2 days and with the team. So I would like to thank for coming this very memorable event. All other distinguished guests, I will not mention anyway. Thank you very much for you all and giving all the support to us. I hope that we can follow this map. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Sepala. And we have put in the chat the link to the website where you can download the full report. And it has a lot of the questions that have been posted in the chat answered in the report. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Minister, His Excellency from the Prince High Commission for joining us for this launch. Thank you.